ancient world of the Gaelic people, a year possessed two distinct faces, a bright, warm face of summer and a dark, cold face of winter. The boundary between them was not a gentle slope, but a sudden, sharp cliff. It was a moment of profound and dangerous transformation, a seam in the fabric of time itself, where the known world seemed to fray at the edges. As the final harvest was brought in from the fields, and the last of the cattle were driven down from their summer pastures on the hills, a change could be felt in the very air. The days grew short, the light thin and silver, and the night stretched into a vast and hungry darkness. This was the pivot of the year, the hinge upon which the world swung from the side of life to the side of death. This was the eve of the Gaelic tradition that is called Samhain. To the ancient peoples of Ireland and Scotland, this was not just a change in the weather. It was a shift in the very nature of reality. Theirs was a world saturated with the supernatural, a landscape alive with consciousness. They understood that the world of humankind was not the only one. Just beyond the veil of our senses, hidden within the ancient earth and mounds, and beneath the silent moss-covered hills, lay another realm. It was known as the Sida, the otherworld, a place that was not a hell of fire and brimstone, but a parallel reality, a timeless and often beautiful land inhabited by powerful, amoral, and mysterious beings. These were the ancestors, the old gods, and the fairy folk, the Aosi. For most of the year, the border between these two worlds was firm, the rules of engagement clear and well-defined. But on the night of Samhain, that border dissolved. The veil grew thin, porous, and all the laws of nature and spirit were suspended. The fairy mounds, the Sida, were said to swing open their hidden doorways, spilling a strange, otherworldly light out onto the darkened land. From these openings, the spirits could emerge and walk freely in the world of mortals. The souls of the ancestors, drawn by the memory of their kin, could return to sit by the hearths of the homes they once knew. This was a time of immense spiritual peril, but also of profound potential. The thinning of the veil meant that the dead could be honored, that the future could be glimpsed, and that the world of magic was closer than at any other time of year. It was a night of sacred dread, of protective ritual, and of communal gathering. Families would extinguish their hearth fires and rekindle them from a single great Samhain bonfire, a symbol of purification and unity against the encroaching dark. They would leave offerings of food and drink for their wandering ancestral guests, and they would disguise themselves in masks and costumes, hoping to fool any malevolent spirits they might encounter in the twilight. This was the authentic heart of the festival, a solemn, eerie, and deeply meaningful confrontation with the mysteries of death, the turning of the seasons, and the unseen world that lies just beyond our own. And yet, if you look upon the modern world on that same night, you will see something vastly different. You will see children in plastic masks going door to door, their bags filled with factory-wrapped candy. You will see suburban lawns decorated with inflatable ghosts and grinning skeletons. You will see a multi-billion-dollar holiday of playful frights and pop culture costumes, a festival of commerce that seems a world away from the sacred bonfires and ancestral spirits of the ancient Gaels. The connection between the two seems almost impossible to believe. How did a sacred night, marking the beginning of winter's darkness, transform into a global celebration of sugar and spectacle? How did the solemn return of the ancestors become a child's cry of trick-or-treat? To find the answer, we must do as the spirits of old did. We must cross the threshold, peel back the modern mask of Halloween, and journey deep into the ancient, whispering soul of Samhain. To understand Samhain, one must first understand the world that gave it birth. Pre-Christian Ireland was not a land of empty fields and silent forests. It was a landscape enchanted, a world where the physical and the spiritual were deeply and inextricably woven together. The very ground was alive with myth. Every mist-shrouded hill, every ancient gnarled oak, every waterlogged bog that held the preserved bodies of forgotten kings was believed to possess a consciousness, a memory, and a power of its own. This intimate, living landscape forged an equally intimate worldview, an understanding that humanity was not the master of the natural world, but merely one small, vulnerable part of a vast and vibrant community of beings. This community was divided into two great halves. There was the world of mortals, the familiar world of hearth and field, of birth and death, of seasons and survival. And then there was the other world, the Sidhe. The Gaels did not conceive of this other realm as being located far away in the heavens or deep beneath the earth in some fiery chasm. It was closer than that. It was a parallel dimension, a sunlit land of eternal youth and vibrant life that existed just beyond the reach of human senses, layered over their own reality like a fine silk veil. It was everywhere and nowhere, a constant, unseen presence. The entrances to this realm were not abstract spiritual concepts, but were believed to be physical places in the landscape. Ancient burial mounds, known as tumuli, were seen as the hollow hills where the inhabitants of the otherworld dwelt. Caves, deep pools of water, and certain forests were all considered thresholds, liminal spaces where one could, intentionally or accidentally, cross from one reality into the next. This belief saturated the Gaelic perception of the world. It meant that every journey was potentially a journey into the supernatural. Every unusual sound in the forest or strange light on the bog could be an encounter with beings from a reality that operated under entirely different laws. This created a worldview steeped in caution, respect, and a healthy dose of fear. The natural world was not something to be conquered or exploited. It was something to be negotiated with, a powerful, conscious entity to be appeased and honored. This worldview was not primitive. It was profoundly sophisticated, a complex ecological and spiritual understanding that recognized the interconnectedness of all things, seen and unseen. The people who lived within this enchanted landscape were not merely surviving. They were participating in a constant, dynamic conversation with the world around them. Their lives were governed by the rhythm of the seasons, a cycle not just of agriculture, but of spiritual significance. The year was a great wheel, turning through periods of light and darkness, of life and death. And at the crucial turning points of this wheel, the boundary between the mortal and the immortal worlds became permeable. These festivals, Imbolc, Beltane, Lugnasad, and most importantly, Samhain, were the moments when the community had to consciously manage its relationship with the immense powers of the otherworld. They were times of ritual, of offering, and of careful navigation, ensuring that the fragile balance between the two realities was maintained for the survival and prosperity of the tribe. The otherworld, the Sidhe, was not the underworld of later Christian belief, a place of punishment and eternal flame. In the Gaelic imagination, it was a parallel dimension of vibrant life and eternal youth, a sunlit land that existed just beyond the reach of human senses. It was the home of the Aos Sea, the people of the Hollow Hills, a powerful and ancient race who were seen as the ancestors, the old gods, and the fairy folk all at once. They were beings of immense power and unpredictable temperament, their actions governed by a code of honor and etiquette that mortals transgressed at their peril. They were not evil, but they were dangerous, a force of nature as immoral and as powerful as a flash flood or a bolt of lightning. The Aosi were believed to be the descendants of the Tuatha De Danann, a mythical race of godlike beings who were said to have ruled Ireland before the arrival of mortals. Defeated in a great battle, they did not depart the world, but rather retreated into the Hollow Hills, into their parallel reality of the Sida, from where they continued to exert a powerful influence over the land and its new inhabitants. They were masters of magic, shapeshifters who could appear as beautiful nobles or fearsome beasts. Their world was a place of enchantment and wonder, where time moved differently. A mortal who stumbled into their realm might spend a single night feasting and dancing, only to return to the human world and find that a century had passed. This temporal distortion was a common theme in Irish folklore, a warning of the profound otherness of the Stida and the dangers of becoming entangled in its affairs. The Aosi were not demons to be universally reviled. They were more akin to powerful neighbors with whom humanity shared the landscape. Like any neighbors, a complex relationship of respect, appeasement, and avoidance was necessary. Offerings were left for them, typically milk or bread, to ensure their goodwill and to keep them from curdling the milk of one's cows or blighting the crops. Certain places, the fairy mounds or lone hawthorn trees, were considered their property and were to be left undisturbed on pain of terrible retribution. To offend the Aosi was to invite disaster, unexplained illnesses, sudden deaths of livestock, or the abduction of children, replaced by sickly changelings. And yet, they could also be generous, bestowing gifts of artistic inspiration, healing knowledge, or even great wealth upon those mortals who showed them the proper respect or who did them a kindness. This duality made them a source of both terror and fascination. They represented the untamed, unpredictable forces of nature and the psyche, the parts of reality that did not conform to human laws or desires. They were a constant reminder to the Gaelic people of their own vulnerability and of the vast, mysterious powers that lay just beyond the thin veil of everyday perception. It was this complex and powerful race of beings that was believed to have unfettered access to the mortal world on the night of Samhain, turning the familiar landscape into a place of profound spiritual danger and otherworldly potential. The most dangerous time of year, the moment when the fragile barrier between these worlds became almost non-existent, was Samhain. It was one of two great liminal points in the year, the other being Beltane. These were times that belonged to neither summer nor winter, nights that stood outside the normal flow of time. On this night, the legends claimed, the great earthen mounds that served as doorways to the other world would swing open and the Aosi could cross into our reality. The medieval saga, The Adventure of Nera, set on Samhain night, captured the atmosphere of sacred dread perfectly, stating that great was the darkness of that night, and demons would appear on that night always. The word demons was a later Christian interpretation, but the raw, primal fear it described was ancient. It was the fear of an encounter with something utterly alien, a power that did not abide by human rules. Samhain marked the end of the bright half of the year and the beginning of the dark half. It was the Celtic New Year, a moment of profound transition. For a society so deeply connected to the agricultural and pastoral cycles, this was a time of immense significance. Summer, the season of life, growth, and expansion, was over. Winter, the season of death, dormancy, and darkness, was beginning. This transition was seen not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden and dramatic shift. The world of order was temporarily suspended, and the forces of chaos were ascendant. This belief was reflected in the very structure of time itself. The Celtic day began at sunset, so the festival of Samhain began on the evening before November 1st. This night stood outside of time. It was not part of the old year, and not yet part of the new. It was a moment of pure potential and pure chaos, a crack in the temporal fabric through which the supernatural could pour. This liminality was the source of both the festival's danger and its power. With the normal laws of reality suspended, anything was possible. The spirits of the dead could return to visit their living kin. The powerful beings of the otherworld could walk the earth, sometimes with malicious intent, sometimes with mischievous purpose. But it also meant that humans could, with the right rituals and precautions, access the power of the otherworld. Divination was particularly potent on this night, as the suspension of time made it possible to glimpse the future that was about to be born. The thinning of the veil was a double-edged sword. It brought humanity face to face with its deepest fears: the darkness, the cold, the unknown forces of the spirit world, and the finality of death. But it also offered a unique opportunity for communion with the ancestors, for gaining hidden knowledge, and for reinforcing the bonds of the community in the face of the encroaching winter. Samhain was therefore a festival of profound ambiguity, a celebration that embraced the terrifying and the sacred, the end and the beginning, all at once. It was a necessary confrontation with the darkness, both outside and within, in order to survive until the return of the light. This belief in a gateway between worlds was not merely an abstract concept. It was anchored to the very soil of the land, to specific sacred sites that were seen as nexuses of supernatural power. Chief among these was the great royal and ritual center of Rathcrogan in modern County Roscommon. For centuries, this was a hub for Samhain, feasting and ceremony, a place where chieftains and priests would gather to worship the nature of the land. But deep within this complex lay a dark and terrifying feature, a limestone fissure in the earth known as Awenagat, the Cave of the Cats. Local legend, passed down for millennia, held that this cave was a literal, physical entrance to the otherworld, an Irish gate to hell, from which monstrous creatures would emerge on the night of Samhain to lay waste to the surrounding countryside. Ancient texts describe terrible beasts, flocks of destructive birds with withering breath, and armies of otherworldly beings streaming from the cave's mouth on this specific night. The mythological Queen Medb was said to have used the cave to unleash supernatural entities upon her enemies. This was not a place of gentle spirits and whimsical fairies. This was a recognized source of cosmic terror, a wound in the earth from which chaos bled into the mortal realm. Archaeological excavations have lent a chilling credence to these ancient stories. While no monster bones have been found, the investigations have revealed piles of animal bones, including those of cats, birds, and badgers, left just inside the cave's mouth. These are interpreted as the physical remnants of ancient offerings, gifts left by the ancient peoples to appease the terrible beings that dwelt within. A desperate attempt to placate the forces of chaos and prevent them from emerging to wreak havoc. The very act of placing these offerings at the threshold of the cave underscores the tangible reality of this belief. For the people who gathered at Rathcrogan for Samhain, the threat was not a metaphor. It was a physical and present danger, located in a specific, known place. The rituals they performed were not mere superstitions. They were a form of spiritual defense, a necessary technology for managing a volatile and dangerous portal. The connection between specific geographical locations and the events of Samhain served to root the festival's mythology in the lived experience of the people. The supernatural was not a distant, ethereal concept. It was a part of their landscape, a feature of their home. This grounding of myth in place gave the beliefs a profound power and endurance. The stories of Owain were not just tales told around a fire. They were explanations for the real and present dangers of the world, a way of understanding and navigating a reality that was believed to be populated by forces far beyond human control. The cave was a constant, stark reminder of what Samhain represented. The night when the locks on the doors to the otherworld were broken, and humanity was left to face whatever might choose to crawl out. The connection between Samhain and the world of the dead reached back even further into the mists of the Neolithic Age. At the legendary Hill of Tara, the seat of the High Kings of Ireland, stands a 5,000-year-old passage tomb known as the Mound of the Hostages. This ancient structure, predating the arrival of the Celts by millennia, is a testament to the deep antiquity of ancestor veneration in Ireland. Archaeologists discovered that its central passage is precisely aligned so that on the morning of Samhain, the first rays of the rising sun penetrate the darkness and illuminate the chamber within. A chamber filled with the cremated remains of hundreds of ancient people. While some experts caution that these solar alignments may not have been intentional and could be coincidental, the image is profoundly powerful. The light of the first day of winter entering a house of the ancient dead, a symbolic reunion of the living and the long departed that speaks to the festival's deep and primordial roots. This alignment suggests that the date of Samhain, or a date very close to it, held a sacred significance for the people of Neolithic Ireland, long before the cultural and religious systems of the Celts took shape. It points to a continuity of belief, a tradition of honoring the dead at this specific turning point of the year that persisted for thousands of years. The act of aligning a monumental tomb with the sunrise on a particular day is an act of immense effort and sophisticated astronomical knowledge. It implies a belief system in which the movements of the sun were inextricably linked to the journey of the soul and the cycle of life and death. The illumination of the tomb at Samhain could have been seen as a moment when the barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors was momentarily breached by a ray of sacred light, allowing for a symbolic communion. It may have been a ritual to awaken the spirits of the dead, to welcome them back into the world for a brief period, or to ensure that the sun, now beginning its winter decline, would eventually be reborn and return to warm the earth again. While the precise meaning of this alignment is lost to time, its existence firmly connects the core themes of Samhain: the veneration of ancestors and the transition from light to dark. To the very earliest settled communities in Ireland, it demonstrates that Samhain was not merely a Celtic festival, but the inheritor of a much older, more ancient spiritual tradition. The Celts did not invent the idea of a festival for the dead at the beginning of winter. Rather, they gave it a new name, a new mythology, and a new set of rituals, building their spiritual house upon a foundation that had been laid thousands of years before. The light striking the ancient bones in the mound of the hostages is a silent stone testament to the festival's enduring power, as a moment for humanity to confront its relationship with those who came before. Faced with such a direct and terrifying intrusion of the supernatural, the people of ancient Ireland did not simply hide. They responded with their most powerful sacred technology: fire. The central ritual of the Samhain festival was the lighting of a great bonfire. According to later folklorists like Geoffrey Keating, this was an ancient druidic rite of profound significance. On the eve of Samhain, all the hearth fires in the district would be extinguished, plunging every home into a symbolic darkness. This act was not merely practical, it was a ritual death. It signified the end of the old year, a wiping clean of the slate, and an acknowledgement of the community's vulnerability in the face of the encroaching spiritual and physical winter. The community would then gather, often on a prominent hilltop, and a single new fire would be kindled, not from an existing flame, but from friction, a need fire born of pure, virgin wood, often by the frantic turning of a great wooden wheel on an axle until it sparked. This new flame was considered pure, untainted by the misfortunes or maladies of the past year. It was a spark of new life and new order, created by the collective effort of the community in the heart of the chaos. This great bonfire served two crucial purposes. Firstly, it was an act of purification. People and their livestock would walk between two great pyres, or leap over the flames, in a ritual cleansing designed to burn away all the sickness, ill fortune, and negative influences of the previous year. The smoke and flames were believed to have potent protective and healing properties, ensuring that both humans and their essential animals would enter the dark winter months in a state of spiritual cleanliness and strength. Secondly, the bonfire was a powerful act of protection. It was a blazing shield of light and warmth against the cold, hungry spirits that were now walking the darkened land. The fire created a circle of sacred, consecrated space, a temporary sanctuary for the mortal community in a landscape that had become hostile and alien. It was an assertion of human order against the chaos of the supernatural, a beacon of defiance in the face of the all-consuming darkness. From this single sacred flame, a torch would be taken to every home, and the family hearth would be rekindled. This act re-established the domestic order, but now, the fire that warmed the home and cooked the food was not just any fire. It was a part of the sacred, communal flame. This ritual bound every family together, linking their individual homes to the collective strength and spirit of the tribe. It was a powerful symbol of the community's renewed unity and its shared determination to survive through the darkness. The Samhain bonfire was therefore far more than a simple celebration. It was a complex and vital piece of spiritual technology, a tool for purification, protection, and social cohesion, all ignited in a single sacred flame against the longest night of the year. While the spectral horrors of the thinning veil occupied the minds of the ancient Gaels, the festival of Samhain served an equally vital and far more tangible purpose. It was not just a night of supernatural chaos. It was a time of profound human order, a crucial fulcrum in the social, economic, and political life of the community. As the darkness of winter descended, the world of the living did not cower and hide. It gathered, it feasted, and it reaffirmed the very laws that held its society together. The other world may have been open for business, but in the great halls of kings and chieftains, so too was the court of man. The timing of Samhain was no accident. It fell at the logical and necessary endpoint of the pastoral year. The growing season was over. The last of the grain had been harvested, and the great herds of cattle, the primary measure of wealth and power in Gaelic society, were brought down from their summer grazing lands in the hills. This influx of resources created both a problem and an opportunity. The problem was one of scarcity. There was not enough fodder to keep the entire herd alive through the long, lean winter months. The opportunity was one of sudden, temporary abundance. A grim but necessary calculus was performed. A significant portion of the livestock, particularly the weaker animals, was slaughtered. This great cull served two purposes. It ensured that the core breeding stock would have enough food to survive until spring, and it provided a sudden and massive surplus of fresh meat. This abundance of meat, combined with the recently harvested grain, which was being rapidly transformed into life-giving beer and ale, created the perfect conditions for a grand, final feast before the hardships of the season began. It was a time to take stock, not just of food supplies, but of all accounts. Debts were settled, rents were paid, and contracts were renewed or concluded. It was the end of the financial year, the moment when the economic books of the tribe were balanced. This pragmatic, orderly function of Samhain was just as important as its spiritual dimension. It was a time when the community organized itself for survival, making the hard decisions necessary to ensure its continued existence through the most difficult part of the year. The festival was therefore a paradox, a time when the supernatural world was at its most chaotic, but the human world was at its most organized and structured. It was a period of intense social and economic activity, a necessary putting of the house in order before the long, enforced inactivity of winter set in. The feasting and celebration were not just a party. They were the celebratory culmination of a year's hard work and the practical preparation for the year to come. This convergence of available food and enforced peace made Samhain the perfect moment for the great assemblies, the Oenach, where the entire social and political life of a kingdom was put on display. As the end of the season of expansion and warfare, a time when the young warriors of the tribe would put away their swords and the farmers their scythes. A peace of Samhain was often declared and enforced by ancient custom. All feuds, raids, and legal disputes were to be set aside, ensuring that clans could gather safely and conduct the urgent business of preparing for the winter. These assemblies were not simply large parties. They were complex, multi-day events that served as the primary political theater of Gaelic society. They were a chance for the king or chieftain to demonstrate his power, wealth, and most importantly, his generosity, a key attribute of a successful ruler. By hosting a magnificent feast, the king reaffirmed his status and secured the loyalty of his subordinate nobles and warriors for the coming year. A king who could not provide lavishly for his followers was a king whose power was seen to be waning. The medieval Irish sagas paint a vivid picture of these gatherings. In the 12th century tale, Mesca Ulad, or the intoxication of the Ulstermen, the great King Conchobar MacNessa hosts a Samhain feast for his nobles at his royal seat of Emain Macha. The text boasts that the king provided 100 vats of every kind of ale, a detail that underscores the sheer scale and importance of the communal revelry. This was a spectacular demonstration of a king's wealth and a way to redistribute that wealth among his followers, binding them to him in a web of obligation and loyalty. But beneath the revelry, a strict social order was being enforced. This was the time for the payment of tribute. The ancient Brehon laws, the legal codes of medieval Ireland, stipulated that tenant farmers owed their chieftain a yearly offering, often in the form of livestock. The pig of Samhain is mentioned specifically as a customary tribute, a symbolic transfer of wealth from the producers of the land to its protectors and rulers. This act reaffirmed the rigid hierarchies of Gaelic society, ensuring that the bonds of obligation between a lord and his people were renewed. The assemblies were also a time for legal proceedings, for the settling of disputes that had been put on hold, and for the arrangement of political marriages. They were a marketplace, a court, and a festival all rolled into one, the vital heartbeat of the kingdom's political life. It was a time when the abstract structures of society became tangible, visible in the seating arrangements of the Great Hall, the quality of the food served to different ranks, and the public acts of submission and reward. Samhain, therefore, was the moment the tribe looked both outwards to the spirits and inwards to itself, reinforcing the social and political bonds that were as essential for survival as any bonfire. The Samhain feast was the centerpiece of the great assemblies, a spectacular event that was as much about political statement as it was about satiating hunger. The great halls of kings and chieftains, often large, timber-framed structures, would be filled with the smoky, fragrant haze of roasting meat and the sweet, heavy scent of mead and ale. These were not quiet, decorous affairs. They were loud, boisterous, and deeply communal. The sagas describe these assemblies as lasting for a full week, 3 days before Samhain, the day itself, and 3 days after, a period filled with meetings and games and amusements, eating and feasting. The sheer logistics of such an event were a testament to the ruler's power. To gather, house, and feed hundreds, if not thousands, of people for a week required immense organizational skill and, more importantly, immense resources. The freshly slaughtered cattle formed the heart of the menu, roasted whole over massive fire pits. The pig of Samhain, the traditional tribute, would also be cooked, its richness a welcome addition as the weather turned cold. This was a time of rare indulgence in fresh meat for many, a final taste of abundance before the winter diet of salted and preserved foods began. Alongside the meat, there would be the fruits of the harvest: bread baked from the last of the grain, root vegetables, and perhaps hazelnuts, which were associated with wisdom and the otherworld. But the true lifeblood of the Gaelic festivity was the drink. The vast quantities of grain harvested were transformed into an ocean of beer and ale. For the higher-ranking nobles, there would be mead, a fermented honey wine that was a symbol of luxury and status. The consumption of alcohol was not just for pleasure. It was a ritual act. The intoxication of the Ulsterman saga, as its name suggests, revolves around the prodigious drinking at a Samhain feast. This state of intoxication was seen as a way to loosen the tongue, to encourage bonding among warriors, and perhaps even to achieve a state of altered consciousness that brought one closer to the spirit world. Within the Great Hall, a strict protocol was observed. Seating was arranged according to rank and status, with the king and his most honored warriors and druids occupying the most prominent positions. To be seated closer to the king's fire was a sign of great favor. The distribution of food and drink also followed these hierarchical lines, with the best cuts of meat, the hero's portion, being awarded to the bravest warrior present, an honor that was often fiercely contested. The feast was a microcosm of the society itself, a place where social bonds were forged and hierarchies were displayed for all to see. It was a powerful tool of social cohesion, a moment when the tribe, from the highest king to the lowest warrior, came together to share in the bounty of the land and to fortify its collective spirit against the looming darkness. The ultimate expression of this societal ordering was the legendary Feast of Tara. According to texts like the Forus Feasa ar Iron by Geoffrey Keating, which drew upon older annals and tales, every 7th Samhain, the High King of Ireland would convene a great assembly at his mythical seat of power. This was far more than a feast. It was the supreme legislative and judicial event in the life of the nation. It was at this Samhain gathering that new laws were proclaimed and old ones were remade. The authority of this assembly was absolute. Any man who dared to break the peace or violate the newly proclaimed laws, the tradition states, would be banished from the kingdom, or even put to death. While the historical reality of this grand national assembly is debated by scholars, it may be more of a mythological ideal than a consistent historical practice. Its powerful place in the mythology of Ireland reveals the fundamental role of Samhain in the Gaelic imagination. It was the time when the community, from the lowest farmer to the highest king, took stock, settled its earthly accounts, and fortified the bonds of law and kinship to survive the long, dark winter ahead. The Feast of Tara, as described in the myths, represented the pinnacle of order and justice. It was said that all the provincial kings and the chieftains of Ireland would attend, bringing with them their poets, their historians, and their judges. For the week of the assembly, Tara became the symbolic center of the world. Here, the history of the people was recited by the bards to ensure it was not forgotten. Genealogies were confirmed, and the legal framework that governed society was reviewed and renewed. The idea that this grand act of lawmaking took place at Samhain is profoundly significant. It stands in stark contrast to the chaos of the supernatural world that was believed to be unleashed on the very same night. As the forces of the otherworld threatened to dissolve all boundaries and rules, humanity's response was to double down on its own laws and structures. The Feast of Tara was the ultimate assertion of human order in the face of cosmic chaos. It was a statement that while the world of spirits might descend into lawlessness, the world of mortals would be governed by justice, tradition, and the collective will of the people, as embodied by their king. This dual nature of the festival, as a time of both supernatural anarchy and supreme social order, is the key to understanding its importance. It was a festival that looked not only to the world of the spirits, but to the very foundations of the world of men. It acknowledged the terrifying power of the unknown, while simultaneously celebrating humanity's ability to create and maintain its own systems of meaning and structure. Samhain was the annual test of society's resilience, a test it met with both sacred ritual and sober law. While kings and chieftains solidified their power with grand assemblies, the true soul of Samhain was kept alive in the smaller, quieter rituals of the common folk. In the turf-smoke-scented darkness of the rural cottages and the windswept clashans of the highlands, the festival was an intimate and deeply personal affair. It was a time not for politics, but for family, for memory, and for a direct, respectful engagement with the unseen world. As the great bonfires burned on the distant hills, the people practiced a host of ancient customs, a complex grammar of folk magic designed to honor the friendly dead, trick the malevolent spirits, and peer, for one night only, through the mists of the future. The most sacred of these traditions began not with a bang, but in silence. Inside the home, as the family gathered for their Samhain meal, a profound and eerie solemnity would descend. This was the dumb supper, a ritual feast for the unseen. An empty chair was drawn up to the table, and a full plate of the best food and a cup of the finest drink was set before it. This place was not empty. It was for the ancestors. It was believed that on this night, the spirits of the family's dead would journey back from the otherworld, drawn by the bonds of kinship, to partake in one last meal with the living. The family would eat in utter silence, listening for the slightest sound, a creak of the floorboards, a whisper on the wind, that might signal the arrival of their honored guests. This was an act of profound hospitality, a loving welcome extended across the veil of death itself, reaffirming that the family was not just a collection of the living, but a continuous line stretching back into the mists of time. It was a way of acknowledging that death was not an absolute end, but a transition to another state of being, and that the bonds of love and kinship were strong enough to transcend that boundary, if only for one night. After the silent meal, the door of the cottage would often be left unlatched and the hearth fire banked low, a welcoming beacon for any wandering ancestral spirits who might be passing in the night. This was not a fearful act, but one of loving duty. These were not the terrifying, monstrous beings from the Sita. These were one's own kin, beloved grandparents, and long-lost children, and they were to be welcomed and honored. This intimate, domestic veneration of the dead was the spiritual core of Samhain for most people. It grounded the great cosmic drama of the turning year in the personal reality of family and loss. It transformed a night of abstract terror into a night of poignant and meaningful reunion, a quiet, powerful statement that even in the face of the great darkness of winter, the light of memory and love could still burn brightly on the hearth. But outside the safety of the home, the night was fraught with danger. The open gateways of the Side did not just release the beloved dead. They also unleashed a host of other, less predictable entities, trickster spirits, capricious fairies, and the sorrowful ghosts of the lonely dead now roamed the landscape. To travel on Samhain night was to risk an encounter from which you might never return. And so, to navigate this perilous environment, people turned to the ancient magic of disguise. This was the tradition of guising or mumming. People, often the young men of the village, would cloak themselves in costumes made of straw, animal skins, or carved wooden masks. Sometimes they would cross-dress, men appearing as women and women as men, a classic folkloric inversion designed to create chaos and confusion. The purpose of this masquerade was twofold. On one level, it was a form of spiritual camouflage. By hiding their human faces and taking on the form of a spirit or an animal, they hoped to move through the night undetected by the wandering Aosi, becoming just another strange creature in the darkness. It was a way of blending in with the supernatural chaos rather than standing out as a vulnerable mortal. The costumes were not meant to be beautiful or funny. They were often intended to be grotesque and unsettling, mimicking the terrifying appearances that spirits were thought to assume. A horse's skull might be mounted on a pole and carried by someone hidden under a white sheet, creating the fearsome figure of the Lair Ban, the white mare, a creature associated with the otherworld. This act of imitation was a form of sympathetic magic. By embodying the spirits, the guisers hoped to gain some measure of control over them, or at least to be accepted as one of their own, thereby ensuring safe passage through the night. On another, deeper level, the act of putting on a mask or costume was a ritual transformation. For one night, the individual shed their normal identity. A poor farmer could become a powerful spirit. A young woman could take on the role of a fearsome winter hag. This temporary dissolution of identity mirrored the dissolution of the boundary between the worlds. It was a willing participation in the chaos of the night, a way of embracing the liminality of the festival. By allowing the normal rules of identity and appearance to be suspended, the community was acknowledging and participating in the larger cosmic suspension of rules that defined Samhain. The masks and straw costumes were therefore not just a disguise. They were a sacred vestment, a tool that allowed mortals to safely step into the chaotic dance of the spirit world, to walk the perilous boundary between the seen and the unseen, and to emerge, hopefully unscathed, when the sun rose on the first day of winter. This practice of guising was not a solitary act of spiritual defense. It was a vibrant and often rowdy form of communal theater. The troops of guisers would not simply wander the night in silence. They would travel from house to house, often in a raucous procession, carrying lanterns and making noise with horns or drums to announce their arrival. At each door, they would offer a performance. This could be a song, a poem, a piece of music, or a short recited verse, often in exchange for an offering of food, drink, or coins. The performance was a crucial part of the exchange. The guisers were not simply begging. They were bringing the spirit world to the doorstep of the home in a controlled, ritualized form. They were acting as intermediaries between the domestic sphere and the wild, chaotic night outside. In exchange for their performance, which brought luck and entertainment, the household was expected to be generous. To refuse the guisers was to risk their displeasure, which, on this magical night, could be interpreted as inviting ill fortune upon the house. This tradition served as a vital act of social cohesion. It bound the village together, linking each household through a shared ritual of performance and reciprocity. It was a night of licensed misrule, where the normal social order was temporarily suspended. The young men of the village, hidden behind their masks, could act with a level of freedom and boisterousness that would not be tolerated on any other night. This provided a necessary social safety valve, allowing for the release of pent-up energy and frustrations in a structured and ritualized way. The world was turned upside down. The spirits walked among men, and men walked disguised as spirits. This temporary inversion of the normal order was a way of ritually acknowledging the power of chaos before order was restored with the coming of the new year's sun. The act of going from door to door also had a deeper symbolic meaning. The geysers were, in a sense, representing the souls of the dead who were believed to be wandering the earth on that night. Like the spirits, they were travelers in the dark who sought welcome and sustenance from the living. By giving food and drink to the geysers, the household was symbolically providing for their own ancestral dead, ensuring that their spiritual obligations were met. The tradition of geysing was therefore a complex social and spiritual practice. It was a form of protective magic, a type of community theater, a mechanism for social bonding and redistribution of resources, and a way to honor the dead, all wrapped up in a single, noisy, and exhilarating package. It was a way in which the community did not just hide from the supernatural chaos of Samhain, but actively engaged with it, imitated it, and in doing so, found a way to master it. With the veil between worlds so thin, Samhain was also the one time of year when mortals felt they could borrow the foresight of the spirits and glimpse what the future held. The night was rich with divination rituals, games that were part social entertainment and part serious magic. Almost all of them focused on the most pressing question in the life of a young person: who they would marry, when they would marry, and what their future life together would be like. These were not idle games. In a society where marriage was a crucial economic and social contract, knowing one's future partner was a matter of immense importance. The most common tools for this were the fruits of the recent harvest, which were believed to be imbued with the magical potential of the season. Apples, long associated in Gaelic lore with the immortality and magic of the otherworld, were central. In the game of apple bobbing, young men and women would try to snatch a floating apple from a tub of water with their teeth. The first to succeed was believed to be the first to marry in the coming year. The difficulty of the task and the public nature of the game made it a fun and competitive, yet spiritually significant activity. A more personal and intense ritual involved a young woman peeling an apple, hoping to keep the peel in one continuous long strip. She would then swing the peel around her head 3 times and let it fall to the floor behind her. The shape the peel formed on the floor was believed to be the initial of her future husband. Another variation involved eating an apple in front of a mirror in a darkened room, hoping to catch a glimpse of the future spouse's face in the reflection. Nuts, the symbol of concentrated life and wisdom, were also used. A young couple would each place a hazelnut on the hearth fire, naming the nuts for themselves. If the nuts burned steadily together, it signified a long and happy union. If they hissed and spat and jumped apart, it was taken as a sign of a quarrelsome and difficult future. These practices, while seeming like simple party games to the modern eye, were undertaken with a degree of genuine belief. The liminality of Samhain night was thought to suspend the normal rules of cause and effect, making it possible for symbolic actions to have a real, predictive power. The rituals provided a way of seeking order in the chaos of life, of using the magical potential of the night to bring a small measure of certainty to the great, frightening unknown of the future. They were a channel for the anxieties and hopes of the young, transforming their concerns about love and marriage into a shared, communal experience. These divination games were a crucial part of the festival's emotional landscape, a moment when the focus shifted from the community's relationship with the past, the ancestors, to its hopes for the future, the next generation. As the night wore on and the spirits walked, a final protective measure was put in place. The iconic image of Halloween, the grinning, candlelit face, has its origins here, but not with the bright orange pumpkin of America. The original jack-o'-lanterns of Ireland and Scotland were carved from hardy, pale-fleshed turnips, mangel-wurzels, or even large potatoes. The process was arduous. The tough flesh of the turnip had to be painstakingly hollowed out, and then a grotesque, demonic face was etched into its skin. A glowing piece of coal from the sacred bonfire or a candle stump was placed inside, and they were set in windowsills or by doorways, or carried aloft on sticks by geysers. Their function was pure apotropaic magic. They were a threat and a ward, designed to frighten away any malevolent spirits that might seek entry to the home. The logic was one of homeopathic magic, to fight fire with fire. By carving the most terrifying face they could imagine and giving it an inner light, the people were creating their own temporary monster, a guardian spirit to turn the terrifying face of the otherworld back on itself. The eerie, flickering light emanating from the pale, gnarled features of a carved turnip would have been a truly unsettling sight in the deep darkness of the rural Celtic landscape, a beacon of defiance that was itself a thing of horror. This practice was deeply rooted in the belief that like attracts like, and that a powerful, evil-looking symbol could repel actual evil. The famous folktale of Stingy Jack, the trickster doomed to wander the earth with his turnip lantern after tricking the devil, was a story invented much later, likely in the 18th or 19th century, to explain a tradition whose true ancient purpose had begun to be forgotten. The story of Jack is a Christianized fable about a sinner who is barred from both heaven and hell, a cautionary tale about outsmarting the devil. But the original purpose of the carved lantern had nothing to do with punishing a sinner, and everything to do with a raw, primal need for protection. It was not a symbol of a damned soul. It was a weapon. It was the ancient equivalent of putting a gargoyle on a cathedral, a monstrous image used to ward off monstrous forces. The turnip lantern was the final line of defense for the home, a personal, domestic version of the great communal bonfire. It was a testament to the creativity and psychological resilience of the people, who, faced with a night of overwhelming spiritual terror, did not just hide from the monsters, but chose to carve their own and use them to guard the fragile light of their homes until the dawn. The true, ancient purpose of the jack-o'-lantern was simply to keep the darkness at bay for one more night. For centuries, the traditions of Samhain were the undisputed law of the land, a spiritual reality as tangible as the turning of the seasons. But a new faith was arriving in the Gaelic world, a faith carried on the tides of empire and evangelism, a faith that brought with it a single, omnipotent God and a host of new saints and martyrs. the arrival of Christianity in Ireland and Scotland, beginning in the 5th century, did not immediately extinguish the old ways. The roots of Samhain were too ancient and too deep to be pulled out so easily. The early Christian missionaries, men like St. Patrick, were often pragmatic. They understood that to succeed, they could not simply declare the entire belief system of the people to be evil. To do so would have created immense resistance. Instead, a long and complex process of spiritual negotiation began. A centuries-long conversation between the old world and the new, resulting in an uneasy marriage of folk belief and church doctrine, a phenomenon known as syncretism. The church's strategy was often one of co-option rather than eradication. They couldn't stop people from gathering at their ancient sacred sites, so they built churches and monasteries on top of them. The holy wells that had been dedicated to Celtic goddesses were rededicated to the Virgin Mary. This allowed the people to continue their traditional practices of pilgrimage and worship, but now within a Christian framework. The same logic was applied to the great festivals. The church understood that it could not simply forbid the celebration of a festival as deeply ingrained in the culture as Samhain. To do so would have been impossible. The solution was not to abolish the festival, but to absorb it, to overlay it with a new layer of Christian meaning that would, over time, obscure but not entirely erase its pagan origins. This process was not always peaceful or straightforward. It was a gradual and often contentious dialogue. Old beliefs about the AOC did not simply vanish. They were reinterpreted. These powerful, amoral beings were reframed within the Christian dualistic worldview. They were demoted from the status of old gods to that of demons, fallen angels, or malevolent sprites, creations of the devil to be feared and shunned. The otherworld was no longer a beautiful parallel reality, but was often conflated with the Christian concept of hell or purgatory. This reinterpretation was a powerful tool of conversion, transforming the complex spiritual landscape of the Gaels into a simpler moral battleground of good versus evil. But even as the official theology changed, the underlying folk beliefs proved remarkably resilient, continuing to bubble just beneath the surface of the new Christian order. The conversation between the two faiths would shape the future of the festival in ways no one at the time could have predicted. The first great change was not a confrontation, but a realignment of the calendar. The Church, in its effort to bring a universal order to the Christian world, sought to establish a fixed and holy timetable. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the Church began to celebrate a feast day on May 13th to honor all Christian martyrs. However, in the year 835, Pope Gregory IV made a decision that would forever alter the destiny of the Gaelic festival. He officially moved the date of this feast to November 1st and expanded its scope to include not just martyrs, but all the saints of the Church, known and unknown. The day was officially designated as All Saints' Day. While some historians note that this decree was not an explicit attempt to target and suppress Samhain, its effect was profound. It placed one of the most important holy days of the Christian year directly on top of the most important holy day of the Gaelic calendar. This was a classic act of religious syncretism. It created a powerful Christian alternative for the people to celebrate at this time of year. Instead of honoring the unpredictable and often terrifying spirits of the Sidhe, the faithful were now encouraged to venerate the holy and benevolent saints in heaven. It was a way of redirecting the powerful spiritual energies that the people already associated with this date towards a Christian purpose. Soon after, another layer was added. The Church, likely under the influence of Abbot Odilo of Cluny in the 10th century, established November 2nd as All Souls' Day, a day of solemn prayer for the souls of the ordinary faithful departed, those believed to be in a state of purification in purgatory. This created a powerful new theological framework for the season. The 3-day period from October 31st to November 2nd became known as All Hallowtide, or Hallowmas. The night of October 31st, the eve of the great festival of All Saints, was now All Hallows' Eve, a name that over the centuries would be shortened and slurred into the familiar word Halloween. For the Church, this was now a time for prayer, vigils, and solemn remembrance of the Christian dead. The focus shifted from a terrifying intrusion of the supernatural into the mortal world to a more ordered and hopeful Christian narrative of salvation and the communion of saints. The old fears about the veil between worlds were replaced with the Christian doctrines of heaven, hell, and purgatory. The Church had successfully captured the calendar, reframing the turn of the seasons within its own sacred story. But the people did not simply abandon their old customs. The ancient traditions had a momentum of their own, and they would not be so easily overwritten. The stage was now set for a fascinating fusion of old and new, where ancient folk magic would learn to speak with a Christian accent. The Christianization of the calendar did not erase the old ways. Instead, the ancient customs were subtly and ingeniously repurposed, their ancient forms filled with new Christian meaning. The great Samhain bonfires were not extinguished. In many communities, they were reconsecrated as Hallowmas fires. Their protective light was now seen as a way to honor the saints, to symbolize the eternal light of heaven, or to guide Christian souls on their journey through purgatory. The act of lighting a great fire at the onset of darkness was too powerful a symbol to be abandoned, so it was simply given a new theological explanation. The purifying and protective qualities of the fire remained a central part of the folk belief, even if the official reason for the fire had changed. The ancient tradition of guising also persisted, but it took on a new and pious form. The practice of souling became common, particularly in the later medieval period in Britain and Ireland. Children and the poor would travel from door to door, no longer disguised as spirits, but as themselves, or sometimes representing the souls in purgatory. At each home, they would offer to sing a prayer or a song for the souls of the family's dead relatives. In exchange for this spiritual service, they would be given a soul cake, a small, spiced cake, often marked with a cross. This was a form of charitable alms that entwined the old custom of house visiting with the new Christian emphasis on prayer and salvation. Each cake eaten was said to represent a soul freed from purgatory. This custom brilliantly merged the old traditions with the new theology. The act of traveling from house to house at night, the performance at the door, and the receiving of food were all direct descendants of the old guising rituals. But the purpose was now framed in entirely Christian terms, an act of charity that aided the salvation of the dead. The old fear of wandering spirits was replaced with a Christian duty to pray for them. Even the divination games continued, though they were often frowned upon by clerical authorities. The desire to know one's future especially regarding marriage, was a powerful human impulse that could not be easily suppressed. While the Church might condemn such practices as superstition, they continued in the domestic sphere, a cherished part of the festive traditions that were passed down through generations. For centuries, this blend of folk practice and official religion coexisted, a testament to the resilience of the ancient beliefs. The people saw no contradiction in attending Mass on All Saints' Day, and then returning home to burn nuts to predict a future marriage. They had created a rich and complex tapestry of belief, weaving the new threads of Christianity into the ancient fabric of their pagan past. The soul of Samhain had not died. It had simply put on a Christian mask. This uneasy peace between folk tradition and church doctrine was shattered in the 16th and 17th centuries with the arrival of the Protestant Reformation. The new Protestant authorities, particularly the austere Calvinists in Scotland and the Puritans in England, viewed this kind of syncretism not as a harmless accommodation, but as a grave theological error. To them, the lingering customs of Samhain, now intertwined with the Catholic celebrations of All-Hallowtide, were not quaint folk traditions. They were the unambiguous works of the devil. They were seen as popish superstitions and idolatrous rituals that the Catholic Church had sinfully allowed to fester. The Reformers' worldview was starkly different from that of medieval Catholicism. They rejected the concept of purgatory, which rendered the practice of praying for the dead, and therefore the tradition of souling, theologically meaningless. They condemned the veneration of saints, viewing it as a form of idolatry that detracted from the singular worship of God. This stripped All Saints' Day of its central importance. The entire theological framework that the Catholic Church had built around the old festival was dismantled. With the Christian justifications removed, the old folk customs were left exposed, and they were now seen in the harshest possible light. The bonfires were no longer viewed as honoring the saints, but as pagan fire worship. The divination games were not harmless fun, but a form of witchcraft, a demonic attempt to usurp God's knowledge of the future. The masquerades of guising were seen as an imitation of demons, a dangerous dalliance with the forces of darkness. In the eyes of the Reformers, Samhain was no longer a time when the veil to the otherworld was thin. It was a time when the gates of hell itself were open, and any celebration of it was a direct invitation to Satan. A theological hammer now fell upon the old ways. Stern Protestant leaders and zealous ministers enacted official bans. In Scotland, the records of kirk sessions are filled with condemnations of those who continued to light Halloween fires or engage in what were now deemed superstitious and profane activities. The Reformation sought to purify the Church, and this purification extended to the daily lives and folk beliefs of the people. It was a war on superstition, and the rich, syncretic traditions of Halloween were a prime target. The festival, which had survived one major religious transformation by adapting, now faced another that sought not to co-opt it, but to destroy it entirely. The deep-seated fear of the supernatural, which had been a core component of the original Samhain, was now amplified and weaponized by the Reformers, but it was redirected. The fear was no longer of the amoral Aosi, but of the absolute evil of the Christian devil, who was believed to be actively using these old traditions to lure souls to damnation. These official suppressions were devastatingly effective in many areas. The public, communal celebration of Samhain was largely erased from the official life of many communities in Scotland, England, and parts of Protestant-controlled Ireland. The great communal bonfires, once the centerpiece of the festival, were ordered to be extinguished. To participate in their lighting was now an act of defiance against both church and state. The old fortune-telling games were condemned as witchcraft, a serious crime that could have deadly consequences. The boisterous, theatrical tradition of guising was suppressed, seen as a disorderly and demonic practice. The festival was driven from the village green into the secret shadows of the home. It became a forbidden tradition, kept alive only in the most remote glens and islands, practiced quietly and in defiance of the new religious authorities. The soul of Samhain was forced to go underground. However, the suppression was not total. In Catholic Ireland, the traditions of All-Hallowtide remained strong, and the folk customs associated with them continued to thrive, albeit with a constant awareness of the disapproval from the Protestant ruling class. Even in fiercely Protestant Scotland, the old ways proved remarkably stubborn. While the public celebrations were curtailed, the private domestic rituals were much harder to police. Families continued to tell ghost stories, to carve turnips, and to play divination games within the safety of their own homes. The festival lost its grand, public, and unifying character, and became smaller, more fragmented, and more secretive. It was transformed from a central event in the community's calendar into a matter of private family tradition, a half-remembered echo of something that had once been much grander. This period of suppression had a profound impact on the festival's development. It severed many of the connections to its original spiritual meanings. The complex theology of the Druids was long gone, and now the Christian framework that had given new meaning to the old practices was also being actively dismantled by the reformers. What was left were the practices themselves, the costumes, the lanterns, the games, often stripped of their original purpose and context. They survived as superstitions or children's games, their deeper significance fading with each passing generation. The festival was being hollowed out, its spiritual core gradually eroded by centuries of religious change and conflict. It was waiting for a time when it could re-emerge, not in its native land, where it was now a shadow of its former self, but on the shores of a new world, where it would be free to reinvent itself once more, far from the disapproving gaze of the old authorities. The old ways of Samhain, driven underground by religious reformation and diminished by the steady march of modernity, might have faded into a mere folkloric memory. But in the 19th century, a great and terrible cataclysm struck Ireland, an event that would not only change the destiny of the nation, but would also inadvertently save the soul of its ancient festival. The Great Famine, from 1845 to 1852, was a period of unimaginable suffering, a perfect storm of potato blight, mass starvation, and brutal colonial policy that killed over 1 million people and forced another million to flee their homeland. This mass exodus, the Great Irish Diaspora, became one of the largest migrations of the century. Packed into the dark, crowded holds of the coffin ships sailing for the shores of North America were not just desperate people, but the ghosts of their traditions. These impoverished immigrants, carrying little more than what they could wear, brought with them a rich cargo of intangible culture: their music, their language, their stories, and their folk beliefs. Among these traditions were the fragmented but deeply ingrained customs of Halloween. For these displaced people, clinging to the traditions of the old country was not just a matter of nostalgia, it was an act of cultural survival. In the bewildering and often hostile environment of the New World, practicing the old customs was a way to maintain a sense of identity, to create a feeling of community, and to connect with the lost world they had been forced to leave behind. Irish, and to a lesser extent, Scottish immigrants poured into the burgeoning cities of the United States and Canada: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Montreal. They settled in dense, close-knit neighborhoods, and in these newly formed communities, the old festival found a new and fertile ground to set down roots. It was here, in the narrow streets of immigrant tenements, that the traditions of Halloween were reborn. They were no longer part of a grand, cohesive spiritual system, but they were cherished nonetheless. They were memories of home, enacted in a new land. The catastrophic events of the famine, while devastating for Ireland, acted as a powerful and unintentional vector for the festival's transmission. The seeds of Samhain, which had been struggling to survive in their native soil, were scattered across a vast new continent, where they would find a different climate, a different culture, and a different future. The journey across the Atlantic was a brutal rite of passage, but the traditions that survived the voyage would soon find themselves transformed, taking on a new life and a new identity in a world that was hungry for ritual and celebration, even if it no longer remembered their original meaning. The terror of the starving fields of Ireland would, through a strange twist of history, give rise to the joyful abundance of the American Halloween. In the New World, the celebration of Halloween was initially confined to these immigrant communities. It was no longer a grand public spiritual event, but a small, domestic celebration, a way to remember the old country and to create a sense of continuity in a bewildering new land. Families would gather by candlelight to tell ghost stories, passing down the ancient tales of the sea day and other spectral encounters. They would play the old divination games, bobbing for apples and reading futures in nutshells, their hopes and anxieties about marriage now playing out in the context of a new and unfamiliar society. These simple, harvest-time rituals were a powerful link to the past, a way of reaffirming cultural identity in the face of immense pressure to assimilate. For the first few decades, Halloween was largely an Irish and Scottish affair, viewed with curiosity and sometimes suspicion by the dominant Anglo-Protestant culture of America, which had its own harvest traditions, like Thanksgiving, but lacked a similar festival of supernatural mischief. However, as the 19th century progressed, the festival began to slowly seep out of the immigrant enclaves and into the wider American culture. Newspapers and magazines started to publish articles about these quaint Celtic customs, and the romantic, spooky imagery of the holiday began to capture the popular imagination. The Victorian era, with its fascination with spiritualism, seances, and Gothic romance, provided a particularly receptive audience for a holiday centered on ghosts and the supernatural. Halloween parties for adults became fashionable, featuring fortune-telling games, spooky decorations, and costume balls. These parties stripped the festival of its deep, ancestral spiritual meaning and repackaged it as a secular, parlor room entertainment. It was the first step in the Americanization of Halloween, transforming it from a solemn folk tradition into a theme for a party. The rituals that had once been used to negotiate with the powerful forces of the otherworld were now being used to entertain guests. This process of adoption and adaptation was crucial. For Halloween to survive and thrive in America, it had to become something that people from all backgrounds, not just those of Celtic descent, could participate in. It had to shed its specific ethnic and religious connotations and become a more universal, secular celebration. The American melting pot was at work, taking this ancient Gaelic festival, stripping it down to its most entertaining and visually appealing elements: the ghosts, the games, the costumes, and rebuilding it as something new, something uniquely American. The soul of Samhain was being translated, and as is often the case with translation, some of its original, deeper meaning was getting lost along the way. It was in this new American context that the most iconic symbol of the holiday would undergo its most significant and fateful transformation. For centuries, the face of the festival had been the gnarled, pale, and often unsettling visage of the carved turnip. But in North America, turnips were not a common or celebrated crop. What was abundant, what was native to the soil, and what was inextricably linked with the American harvest was a large, round, and vibrant orange gourd: the pumpkin. The shift from turnip to pumpkin was driven by simple pragmatism. Pumpkins were bigger, making them a more impressive and visible decoration. They were softer and had a hollow seed cavity, making them infinitely easier to carve than the dense, woody flesh of a turnip. By a simple accident of agriculture and convenience, the American jack-o'-lantern was born. This was more than a mere substitution of vegetables. It was a profound symbolic shift. The American pumpkin lantern, with its bright, cheerful color and its often comical, grinning face, was a world away from its grim and grotesque European ancestor. The old turnip lantern was a thing of the earth, pale and ghost-like, its terrifying face an embodiment of the fear and dread of the encroaching winter darkness. It was a weapon of apotropaic magic, a fearsome ward against real evil. The new pumpkin lantern was a symbol of the new world's bounty, of its optimism, and of the festival's slow but steady transformation from a solemn night of spiritual dread into a season of playful, family-friendly fun. Its vibrant orange color was not the color of ghosts, but the color of the autumn harvest, of warmth and abundance. The first known printed image of a carved pumpkin in this new role appeared in an 1867 edition of Harper's Weekly. The woodcut shows a group of children and adults gleefully carrying a lit pumpkin effigy, a scene of pure harvest-time revelry. The image was a declaration. The ancient, haunted turnip of the old world was dead. Long live the American pumpkin. By the turn of the 20th century, this new jack-o'-lantern had become the undisputed emblem of Halloween across the continent. It was a perfect symbol for the Americanized holiday. It was big, it was bright, and its scariness was now mostly for show. The genuine terror that had inspired the original turnip carving had been replaced by a manufactured playful fright. The jack-o'-lantern was no longer a shield against malevolent spirits. It was now a welcoming beacon on the porch, a sign that this house was a participant in the new, festive, and increasingly commercial celebration of Halloween. The other traditions were also adapting to their new home. The solemn, prayerful act of souling and the raucous, performative tradition of guising began to merge and simplify in the more secular and socially mobile landscape of North America. The old overtures of spiritual protection and communal obligation gave way to a more straightforward, playful form of begging. The complex rituals were being flattened into a simple transaction. This evolution found its ultimate expression in a new and uniquely North American phrase. The first recorded instances of the words trick or treat began to appear in Canadian newspapers in the late 1910s and in the United States by the 1930s. This new phrase perfectly captured the holiday's changing spirit. The sacred threat of the otherworld, the danger of offending the powerful Aosi, had been domesticated into a mischievous, childish trick. The threat was no longer of having your livestock die or your child stolen, but of having your windows soaped or your gate taken off its hinges. The ancient offering to a wandering spirit, or the charitable gift of a soul cake to aid the dead, had been transformed into a treat, a simple reward given to stop the prank. The deep spiritual grammar of the old festival was being forgotten, replaced by a simple, catchy slogan that was perfectly suited to a new century and a new world. Trick or treat was a child's game, a form of licensed misrule that was now firmly in the hands of the young. The old geysers were often young men, on the cusp of adulthood, their activities a form of social ritual that tested the boundaries of the community. The new trick-or-treaters were children, their activities largely seen as harmless fun. This shift in demographics was crucial. As Halloween became increasingly focused on children, its scarier, more adult themes were downplayed. The festival was being sentimentalized and domesticated, remade into something safe and charming. The costumes also changed. While the old geysers wore costumes of straw and animal hide to imitate spirits, the new trick-or-treaters began to wear costumes that reflected the popular culture of their time. They dressed as ghosts and witches, but also as cowboys, pirates, and characters from the radio or the movies. The purpose of the costume was no longer to blend in with the spirit world, but to stand out, to express individual creativity, and to participate in a shared cultural fantasy. The soul of Samhain had survived the long voyage across the Atlantic, but in the process, it had begun to forget its own name. It was now speaking a new language, the language of playful threats and sugary rewards, a language that was fast becoming a cornerstone of American childhood. As the 20th century unfolded, Halloween's transformation from a half-remembered immigrant folk custom into a full-fledged American cultural institution began in earnest. The mischievous energy that had once been the domain of guising adults had been transferred to the nation's children, and their tricks were often becoming a genuine problem. The night became associated with vandalism and petty crime, a night of mischief where fences were torn down, windows were soaped, and outhouses were tipped over. This was a secularized, adolescent version of the old festival's theme of misrule and chaos, but it was now a civic nuisance rather than a sacred tradition. In response to this growing civic disorder, a uniquely American solution was devised: organized fun. Communities across the country, particularly in the Midwest, began to host public Halloween festivities, parades, costume contests, and town parties in an effort to channel the chaotic energy of the youth into supervised and family-friendly events. This was the first major step in taming the holiday, in stripping it of its last vestiges of wild, unpredictable spirit and repackaging it as a safe, wholesome civic celebration. The Great Depression gave a further push to this trend. With resources scarce, destructive pranks were seen as particularly wasteful and harmful. Community organizations, and later, city governments, promoted the idea of a safe and sane Halloween, urging parents and community leaders to provide organized alternatives to unsupervised trick-or-treating and vandalism. The focus shifted from the private act of going door to door to the public spectacle of the parade. These events celebrated community spirit, creativity in costume making, and good, clean fun. They were an attempt to impose order on a holiday that was fundamentally about chaos. This taming of the holiday was a continuation of the process of secularization. The last echoes of spiritual danger were being systematically scrubbed away. Halloween was no longer about negotiating with the spirit world, but about negotiating with the local teenagers. The festival was being fully integrated into the fabric of American civic life, becoming another occasion for communities to come together and celebrate their shared values that were increasingly centered on safety, order, and family-friendly entertainment. The wild, liminal night of Samhain was being transformed into a well-lit, highly organized, and thoroughly predictable community event. The ghosts were still invited, but they were now expected to be on their best behavior and to march neatly in the parade. The true catalyst for the creation of modern Halloween, however, would come after the Second World War. The post-war economic boom, the rise of the suburbs, and the creation of a powerful new consumer class created the perfect conditions for the holiday to be not just celebrated, but sold. The ritual of trick-or-treating, which had been a localized and sometimes discouraged practice, exploded in popularity in the 1950s. The baby boom created a massive new generation of children, and their families were moving into newly built suburbs with their quiet streets and rows of houses that were perfect for going door to door. Trick-or-treating became a rite of passage for the children of the baby boom. And where children went, corporate marketers were sure to follow. Candy companies, who had previously focused their efforts on holidays like Christmas and Easter, suddenly saw a massive, untapped market. They began to produce smaller, individually wrapped candies that were perfect for handing out to large numbers of children. They launched aggressive advertising campaigns that explicitly linked their products to the joy of trick-or-treating. Ads in magazines and on the new, powerful medium of television depicted beaming children in store-bought costumes receiving handfuls of brand-name chocolates and sweets. The old offering of a soul cake, a piece of fruit, or a handful of nuts was being systematically replaced by a new expectation of mass-produced, commercially branded candy. The costume industry also boomed. Before the 1950s, costumes were almost always homemade. Now, companies began to mass-produce costumes, often featuring licensed characters from popular television shows and movies. These costumes were sold in boxes in department stores, complete with a plastic mask and a vinyl smock. This shift from homemade to store-bought changed the nature of the holiday. It became less about personal creativity and folk tradition, and more about participating in a shared consumer culture. Children were no longer dressing as generic spirits, but as specific, branded characters, turning the trick-or-treating procession into a parade of pop culture icons. The post-war era locked in the key elements of the modern American Halloween: the suburban setting, the focus on children, the ritual of trick-or-treating, and most importantly, the central role of commercial products. The festival was no longer just a cultural event. It was becoming a major economic one. The ancient spirits of Samhain, who had once demanded offerings of grain and livestock, were now being replaced by a new pantheon of candy corporations and costume manufacturers, and their demands were far more specific. This process of commercialization was dramatically accelerated in the 1960s and 70s by a new and uniquely modern form of folklore: the urban legend. A wave of panic, amplified by sensationalist media reports, swept across the country, centered on the terrifying idea that malevolent strangers were poisoning Halloween candy or hiding razor blades and needles inside apples. This fear, which tapped into a growing anxiety about the safety of an increasingly anonymous suburban world, had a profound and immediate effect on the holiday. Homemade treats, once a cherished part of the tradition, were now viewed with deep suspicion. Parents began to meticulously inspect their children's candy, throwing away anything that was unwrapped or seemed unusual. The only safe candy was one that came from a factory, sealed in its own tamper-proof wrapper. The irony of this panic is that it was almost entirely baseless. The sociologist Joel Best, who has spent decades studying the phenomenon, has found no evidence that a single child has ever been killed or seriously injured by a contaminated treat received from a stranger while trick-or-treating. The few documented cases of poisoned candy were tragic, but they were invariably committed by a family member, often in an attempt to cover up a domestic crime or for insurance fraud, not by a faceless monster hiding in the suburbs. Yet, the myth was more powerful than the reality. The poisoned candy scare became a modern folk panic, a story that reflected adult anxieties about the loss of community, the dangers of modern life, and the vulnerability of children. And it had a huge, unintended commercial consequence. It effectively completed the industrialization of Halloween. It created a powerful social mandate for store-bought, factory-sealed products, turning candy manufacturers into the undisputed gatekeepers of the new tradition. The fear of the anonymous stranger handing out a poisoned apple made the branded, individually wrapped chocolate bar seem like a symbol of safety and security. The candy industry could not have designed a better marketing tool. The ancient fears of Samhain were of real supernatural dangers, spirits that could steal your soul. The modern fears of Halloween were of purely human dangers, psychopaths who could poison your candy. This shift reveals how much the festival had changed. Its focus was no longer on the boundary between the human and the supernatural, but on the boundary between the safe, known community and the dangerous, unknown stranger. The ritual of trick-or-treating, which had begun as an act of communal engagement, was now tinged with paranoia, and the solution to that paranoia was to place one's trust not in one's neighbors, but in the sterile, sealed products of a distant corporation. By the end of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. Halloween had become a multi-billion-dollar industry, second only to Christmas in terms of consumer spending. Its landscape was no longer the misty hills of ancient Ireland, but the brightly lit aisles of the seasonal superstore. Its rituals were no longer the sacred lighting of a bonfire, but the purchase of a plastic costume, and a bulk bag of miniature candy bars. The deep, resonant spiritual questions about life, death, and the other world had been replaced by a much simpler question. What are you going to be for Halloween? The holiday had also expanded beyond its focus on children. Halloween parties for adults became increasingly popular and elaborate, driving a huge market for adult costumes, decorations, and alcoholic beverages. Haunted house attractions, once simple community fundraisers, evolved into sophisticated, high-tech enterprises, a form of scary entertainment that provided a safe, controlled dose of fear. The festival's imagery was now dominated by pop culture. The classic figures of ghosts, witches, and skeletons were joined by a constantly rotating cast of movie villains, superheroes, and internet memes. The meaning of the costume had shifted entirely. It was no longer about hiding from spirits, but about public performance, about cleverness, humor, and cultural relevance. The ancient festival that had once confronted the very real terror of the encroaching darkness had been remade in America's own image. A bright, loud, and profoundly commercial celebration of fantasy, spectacle, and consumption. The old gods were not just forgotten. They had been replaced by the new gods of the marketplace. The success of this new American Halloween was so profound that it began to be exported back to the rest of the world, including the very places where it had originated. Ireland and Scotland began to see the influx of American-style Halloween traditions, pumpkins replacing turnips, trick-or-treat supplanting old guising rhymes, and store-bought costumes becoming the norm. It was a strange and ironic turn of events. The festival, having crossed the ocean and transformed itself entirely, was now returning to its ancestral home, not as a rediscovered piece of ancient heritage, but as a globalized American commercial phenomenon. The journey of Samhain had come full circle, but the festival that returned was a vastly different creature from the one that had left centuries before. Its soul had been traded for a seemingly endless supply of candy and a dizzying array of plastic masks. And so, the story could have ended there, in the bright, noisy, and profitable landscape of the American 20th century. The ancient spirit of Samhain, it would seem, had been fully and finally exorcised, its last ghost laid to rest under a mountain of candy wrappers and plastic masks. But even as the mainstream embraced this new and simplified Halloween, a quiet rebellion was stirring. In the margins of society, among those who felt a deep and abiding hunger for something more than spectacle, a search for the festival's lost soul had begun. Beginning in the latter half of the 20th century, a powerful new spiritual movement began to emerge into the public consciousness. This was modern paganism, a diverse collection of faiths like Wicca and Celtic Reconstructionism, which sought to revive and reimagine the pre-Christian religions of Europe. For these new practitioners, Samhain was not a historical curiosity. It was a living and vitally important sacred day. They looked past the commercial Halloween, back to the old texts and folkloric accounts, and began the work of reconstruction. They adopted Samhain as one of the great Sabbats in their modern Wheel of the Year, celebrating it as the Celtic New Year, a time that marked both the final harvest and the sacred moment of death and rebirth. In clearings in the woods and in suburban living rooms, new covens and circles gathered to relight the old fires. They built ancestor altars, adorned with the photographs of their beloved dead, with skulls and autumn leaves, leaving offerings of bread and wine. They revived the ancient practice of the dumb supper, sharing a silent meal with the spirits of their kin. And they practiced divination, using tarot cards and scrying mirrors to peer through the thinned veil into the coming year. Their work was not a perfect, unbroken continuation of the ancient ways. It was a modern act of spiritual archaeology, a conscious and heartfelt effort to reclaim the fragments of a lost world and piece them back together into a faith that could speak to the needs of a modern soul. It was a rejection of the commercial holiday's superficiality and an attempt to reconnect with the profound life and death mysteries that lay at its core. At the same time, another kind of revival was taking place back in the old country. In Ireland and Scotland, a renewed pride in Gaelic heritage began to flourish. The ancient festival was now seen not just as a religious rite, but as a vital piece of the national culture. Grand public celebrations were born, most famously the Samhain Fire Festival in Edinburgh. Here, on a cold autumn night, thousands gather on Calton Hill to watch a spectacular, modern reenactment of the ancient drama. Great processions of drummers and torchbearers, costumed as the courts of summer and winter, engage in a ritual battle that culminates in the lighting of a massive bonfire. This is not an act of ancient pagan worship, but one of modern public art, a powerful and popular celebration of a shared and unique cultural inheritance. We return, then, to our original question. What became of the ancient soul of Samhain? We have followed its long and winding path from the misty hills of the Iron Age Celts through its contentious marriage with the Christian Church, across the vast ocean to a new world that would remake it in its own image. We have seen it transformed from a night of sacred terror into a holiday of commercial delight. The answer, it seems, is that the soul of the festival never truly died. It simply fractured. Today, two festivals exist side by side on the same night. There is the one we all know, the bright and noisy ghost of the original, a creature of pop culture and commerce, a night of harmless fun that asks nothing of us but our participation in its spectacle. But just beneath it, the ancient heart still beats. It beats in the quiet reverence of a pagan circle honoring their dead. It beats in the thunderous drums of a fire festival in the hills of Scotland. And it beats in the simple, private act of lighting a candle for a loved one who has passed. The true soul of Samhain is not found in a costume or a piece of candy. It is found in the timeless and necessary human need to confront the darkness, both in the world and in ourselves. It is the need to feel the presence of those who came before us, to honor the great chain of which we are all a part. And it is the need to gather together as a community, to share our light, and to find the warmth and strength to face the coming winter. The forms may change, the names may be forgotten, but that ancient, fundamental human impulse remains. The modern Halloween, with its deep Gaelic roots, is often confused with other, superficially similar festivals, most notably Mexico's Dia de los Muertos. But while both traditions share a profound respect for the ancestors, their origins and customs are worlds apart. Dia de los Muertos is a vibrant and colorful celebration born from the syncretism of ancient Mesoamerican beliefs and Spanish Catholicism. To conflate these two distinct and beautiful traditions is to erase the very histories that give them their power and meaning. The soul of Samhain is a specific one, born of the cold, dark winters of the north, of the belief in a parallel world hidden within the hills. That soul is not lost. it lives on, waiting in the gathering dark for any who choose to remember and to relight the ancient fires.